There is a particular hour when the body forgets how to move, when the eyes open but the hands stay folded into the sheets like something has decided for you. You know this quiet, the weight at the foot of the bed, the shape that was not there a moment ago. Tonight we linger in that stillness together, in the long soft breath before waking, and we listen. 3 a.m. and I am already awake, flat on my back, staring at the ceiling with the particular stillness of a man who has not chosen to be still. I cannot move. Not the drowsy paralysis of a body reluctant to surface from sleep. Something else. Something deliberate, like a hand pressed flat against my chest from the inside. It is standing in the corner by the wardrobe, not a shadow. Shadows behave. They follow the geometry of light and they stay where they are put. This is a shape. Thick through the shoulders, the way a man looks when he has spent years carrying something heavy. Its head sits slightly too low, as though the neck beneath it has compressed under some enormous and patient weight. It is not moving toward me, it is simply there, the way a creditor stands outside a door saying nothing, needing to say nothing, because both parties already understand the nature of the debt. It is breathing. I can hear it across the room, slow and oceanic, pulling in and releasing air at intervals that do not match my own. My lungs are working fast, shallow, frantic. The shape breathes like something that has never once been afraid. I cannot scream. I cannot blink. My eyes are beginning to burn and still I cannot close them, because some animal part of me understands that I must not lose sight of it. Then my finger moves. One finger, dragging maybe half an inch across the mattress, the sound of it no louder than a whispered word. The shape tilts its head, slowly, precisely, the way you tilt your head when you have just heard the exact confirmation you were waiting for. My alarm goes off at 6. The corner is empty. The coffee is too hot, but I drink it anyway, standing at the kitchen counter in yesterday's clothes, because sitting down feels like a concession I'm not prepared to make. Sunlight is doing its honest work across the linoleum. Birds are making their ordinary morning sounds. The world is performing normalcy with great commitment, and I am watching it from somewhere slightly behind my own eyes. 7 months. The same corner, the same shape with its compressed neck and its patient creditor's stillness. I have read the literature. Sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucination, the brain misfiring between states, the body's paralytic chemistry bleeding into waking consciousness. I have said these words to myself so many times they have worn smooth, like stones handled past the point of meaning. I stopped the medication in February because the episode stretched under it, grew elastic and enormous, sometimes holding me for what felt like hours. I stopped leaving the lamp on in March after I noticed the figure was sharper in the light, more particular, more present, as though the darkness had been doing me a mercy I had not appreciated. The coffee cup is empty. I do not remember finishing it. I think about the paper. My grandmother had pressed it into my palm the week before she died, her thumb rubbing once across my knuckles in that way she had, equal parts tenderness and instruction. I had unfolded it in the car and read it twice, and driven home telling myself I was not the kind of man who kept that sort of thing. I had tucked it into the nightstand drawer anyway. I had not thought about it seriously until now, standing in my sunlit kitchen, feeling the hollow place behind my sternum where 7 months of something deliberate has slowly been taking up residence. I set down the cup. I go upstairs. The paper is folded into quarters, the creases gone soft and grey with age. Her handwriting is smaller than I remembered, economical, as though she had understood that every word cost something and had chosen accordingly. I read it once at the kitchen table with the empty cup still in my hand. Then I read it again more slowly, my lips moving the way they do when I'm trying to make sure I've understood the exact shape of a thing. The instructions are specific in a way that unsettles me more than vagueness would. A bowl of water, not running, not salted, nothing added. The new moon for the dark. The spoken words, and she has underlined spoken twice, pressing hard enough that the pen scored the paper slightly. Whatever I am most afraid of losing, named aloud into the room, and then the invitation itself, which she has written out in full, in a formal declarative construction that I read several times before I can make myself stop. Freely given, no resistance, no fight. One night, and then 1 year of peace, the terms settled, the account balanced. And then the final line, which she has separated from the rest by a full inch of white space, as though she wanted it to have room to breathe. When the year ends, it will return to collect the remainder of what was promised, and you must not lock the door. I do the math twice, standing at the window with the thin spring light coming flat across the page. The last new moon was 3 nights ago. I perform the ritual that evening, speaking the words into the stillness with my voice steadier than I expected. I set the bowl on the floor. I lie back. I sleep for 11 hours. I do not dream of anything at all. 11 months and 28 days. The year had been, by every measurable standard, good, better than good. There was Claire beside him now, her breathing slow and even, one hand loosely curled against the pillow the way it always was when she felt safe. There was the promotion, the apartment with the second bedroom they had started cautiously, to discuss turning into something else. There were mornings that arrived like ordinary mornings, carrying coffee and birdsong and the small reliable weight of a life that had been assembled with intention rather than desperation. He had stopped thinking about the letter entirely somewhere around September. The bowl had been washed and returned to the cabinet. The folded paper had migrated to the back of a drawer beneath old receipts and a broken watch. The terms of the agreement had grown soft at the edges, the way old fear does when the months pile up between you and the moment you made a choice you cannot quite defend in daylight. He woke at 3 a.m. with no sound and no cause that he could name. The room was exactly as he had left it. Claire breathed beside him. The curtains held the pale residue of the streetlight outside. Everything was where everything was supposed to be, and the corner near the wardrobe was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of light, and everything to do with the quality of it. A density that did not belong to shadow, a stillness that was not passive but attentive, gathered, patient in the manner of something that has learned how to wait because it has always known the date. He did not speak. He reached for his phone. The screen read 3004 AM, and the date beneath it sat in his chest like a stone dropped into standing water. 2 nights remained. He read it 3 times before he accepted that he was looking for something that was not there. The paper was thinner than he remembered, softened at the folds from a year inside the drawer, and it carried the faint mineral smell of old ink and something else beneath that. Something he associated now with the quality of darkness in that corner, something that had no name in the vocabulary of ordinary things. The handwriting in the body of the document was neat, deliberate, the careful script of a woman who had grown up when penmanship still meant something. But the final clause was different. The lines wavered. The pressure of the pen had changed, heavier in some places as though her hand had needed steadying, lighter in others as though she had lost the will to press. 1 night of complete surrender, underlined twice, the second line slightly crooked. He had noticed the underline before. He had not noticed until now that the ink on that line had bled a little at the edges, the way ink does when the hand holding the pen is shaking. She had known, not as a grandmother passing along the particular superstitions of a particular place with warmth and a kind of gentle authority. She had known because she had already sat where he was sitting, already watched the year run down, already faced the page with whatever she still had left after paying once. She had written it for him so that the choice would be his, which was either a great kindness or the cruelest thing she had ever done, and he could not decide which. He pulled the bowl from beneath the bed. It was dry and cool and lighter than it had any right to be. He set it on the floor in front of him and did not fill it. He sat on the edge of the mattress. He watched the corner. The sun came up and the corner did not change. He filled the bowl at 11, watching the water settle into stillness, watching his own reflection stare back at him from the surface with an expression he did not entirely recognize. He had sent Maya to her sister's place that afternoon, some story about an early call, a work thing, and she had kissed him on the cheek and told him not to stay up too late, and the ordinary tenderness of that had nearly undone him. The apartment was quiet in a way it had not been all year. Not the quiet of late hours and closed windows, something more deliberate than that. A silence that had weight and direction, a silence that was oriented toward the corner. At 11 he thought about the deadbolt. The thought arrived fully formed, almost rational. One small act of refusal. He crossed the room and put his hand on the cold metal, and stood there long enough that his eyes adjusted to the dark in the hallway beyond the door and he could see the grain of the wood and the shadows gathered at its base. His fingers curled around the bolt. Then he thought about the first morning, waking without the grey film behind his eyes, coffee that tasted like coffee, a phone call he had been dreading for months that had gone, somehow, well. The year assembled itself in his mind in pieces, small mercies and quiet victories, and the simple, ordinary miracle of sleeping through the night. All of it downstream from one decision. All of it real. He had spoken the words. He had placed the bowl. The bargain had not begun the night it came to collect. It had begun the night he invited it. He took his hand off the deadbolt and went back to the bed and sat and waited. He lay back on the mattress and put his arms at his sides and looked at the ceiling and waited for midnight to find him. It did not build. There was no slow thickening of shadow, no gradual withdrawal of light. One moment the corner was empty and the next it was not, and the shape stood there the way it always stood, patient and dense, its head hung at that wrong angle, too low, as though something in its neck had long since given up on holding. But tonight it did not stay in the corner. He had known it would not. The paralysis came as it moved toward him, spreading up through his legs and into his chest like cold water rising in a basement, total and unhurried. His lungs still worked, his eyes still moved. Everything else was gone. It stopped at the edge of the bed and stood over him, and he stared past it at the ceiling and felt the weight of its attention, the way you feel the heat of something burning close to your skin without looking at it directly. He did not know how long it lasted. Time had stopped being useful. On the floor, the bowl tipped without being touched. The water spread outward across the wood in a slow, perfect circle, and caught what little light remained and then went still. When the paralysis finally released, it left nothing behind but silence and the grey particular light of very early morning. The corner was empty. His hands were his own again. He sat up slowly and pressed them flat against his thighs, and breathed until his breath stopped shaking. He was intact. That was the word that came to him. Intact. He got up. He went to the kitchen. He made coffee and stood at the window and watched the street below come pale and quiet into morning, and before the first cup was finished he was already counting the days to the new moon. The timestamp reads 2:47 a.m, and my hands will not stop shaking. I've pressed them flat against the desk, fingers spread wide against the wood, and still I can feel the tremor moving through my wrists, up into my forearms, settling somewhere deep behind my sternum where it has been living for the past hour. The laptop screen is the only light in the room. It is 4 in the morning, and I'm still wearing yesterday's clothes, and I have watched this same 30 seconds of footage 11 times. The figure is in the corner, the far corner, past the foot of the bed, where the closet door sits open exactly 3 inches the way it always does, because the hinge is warped, and I have never bothered to fix it. It is standing in that narrow gap between the door and the frame, and if you did not know to look for it, you might not see it at all. You might see only shadow pooling the way shadow does at that hour, but I know to look for it now. I drag the playhead back. I watch myself sleeping. I watch the shape standing absolutely still with a patience that does not belong to anything living. And then the counter rolls to 2 minutes and 11 seconds, and something shifts in the geometry of that darkness. A slow and deliberate rotation, and the face, if it is a face, turns, not toward the bed, not toward me, toward the lens, toward exactly the angle from which something would one day be watching. Let me back up. I have had sleep paralysis since I was 26. 8 years of waking into a body that will not answer. 8 years of the chest pressure, the sense of presence, the figure that stands at the edge of vision and refuses to resolve into anything nameable. I know the clinical vocabulary the way you know the layout of a house you grew up in. Hypnagogic hallucination. Riem atonia. The shadow figure, which is not my invention, which appears in the accounts of sufferers across every culture and continent, with a consistency that neurologists find fascinating, and I used to find reassuring. It has a name, it has a mechanism. It is the brain misfiring at the threshold between sleep and waking, conjuring threat from darkness the way it was always designed to do. I was never frightened by the episodes themselves. I was frightened 6 weeks ago by the pattern. 3 nights on, 1 night off, 3 nights on, 1 night off. I noticed it first as a vague suspicion, the kind you dismiss because the alternative is something you're not ready to consider. I started keeping notes on my phone. Date, time, duration. whether the figure was present or only the pressure. I filled 2 weeks of entries before I laid them out on the screen and sat very still for a long time. The spacing was exact. Not approximate, not suggestive. Exact. The kind of regularity you could use to calibrate an instrument. The kind that does not come from a tired brain misfiring. The kind that comes from intention. I ordered the camera on a Tuesday and it arrived on Thursday, and I spent an hour drilling the bracket into the wall above the headboard with the kind of focused, methodical energy that is really just fear with somewhere to put itself. Wide angle, low light capable, a little blinking red eye that I covered with electrical tape because I did not want to watch it watching me. I angled it carefully, checking the frame on my phone until the far corner near the closet sat cleanly in the shot. Nothing cropped, nothing hidden. Then I went to bed and I did not sleep well, which was not surprising. The first 3 nights I woke, checked my phone to confirm the recording had run, and set the device face down on the nightstand without opening the file. I told myself I was being thorough, letting the sample size accumulate. I knew I was lying. On the 4th morning I made coffee first, both hands around the mug. Then I sat at the kitchen table and I watched. The corner was not empty. It stood there for 2 hours and 40 minutes without moving, without variation, a shape that was almost human the way a shadow of a human is almost human, assembled from the low light and the compression noise and the slightly open closet door. That was what I told myself. I watched it for a long time, looking for the moment it would dissolve into something explainable. It did not dissolve, and I did not close the closet door. I do not know why I did not close the closet door. I watched every night after that. I made it a ritual. The coffee, the kitchen table, the phone flat on the wood in front of me. 7 nights of footage laid end to end in my memory like a film strip I could not stop developing. The shape was in every one. Same corner, same approximate posture, if posture is even the right word for something that had no discernible shoulders, no clear head, only the suggestion of verticality, of presence. The way you know a room is occupied before you can say why. I started marking its position against the seam where the 2 walls met, that precise right angle in the corner, using it as a fixed reference point the way a surveyor uses a benchmark. I measured the distances on screen with my thumb and forefinger and wrote the numbers in the same notebook where I had logged the waking times. 2 inches per night, consistent, unhurried. I did the arithmetic 3 times because I did not want to trust myself. At that rate, the shape would reach the side of my bed in 23 more nights. I ordered a motion sensor the same afternoon and mounted it that evening angled to cover the corner. The instruction manual said the sensitivity threshold would ignore objects smaller than a house cat. I set it anyway and went to bed and lay there watching the ceiling. At 1:11 in the morning, before I'd managed to sleep before my eyes had even grown heavy, the sensor went off. I moved to the sofa and told myself I was being practical. The bedroom was where the footage lived, where my eyes had trained themselves to look for it, and a different room would break the circuit. That was the theory. I lasted 4 hours on the cushions before my phone lit up with the first sensor alert, and I lay very still and watched the notification like it was something that might move. It triggered every night after that, and then I added the hallway sensor, mostly to prove to myself there was interference, a moth, a draft bending the curtain, something with mass and logic and explanation that fit inside a sentence. The hallway sensor triggered 11 minutes after the bedroom one, every night. 11 minutes, as if whatever it was moved at a pace it had decided on, and saw no reason to vary. I called Marcus. I told him as much as I could, which was not much, and he drove 40 minutes in the dark without asking me to make more sense than I had. We slept in the living room together, and in the morning he sat with my phone and scrolled through the sensor logs without saying anything for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the sofa and stood at the end of it, measuring something with his eyes, and his face did a thing I had not seen it do before. He said the sofa was 18 inches closer to the hallway than the bed had been to the corner on the first night. I spent 3 days at Marcus's kitchen table going over everything I had. I printed the sensor logs, laid the camera screenshots in order, and drew a rough floor plan on the back of an envelope. The shape had never done anything. That was the part I kept returning to. In every frame, in every clip, it stood. It did not pace or crouch or reach. Once it had turned its head, and that was the whole of its biography. It had never been recorded moving, and yet every morning it was closer, patient and incremental, like a tide that only came in. The sensor light was the key. The moment it triggered, the red glow filled the room for 15 seconds before resetting to darkness. 15 seconds of visibility, and then a gap. I understood then that it was using the gap. It was not afraid of me or the camera. It was waiting for the dark between cycles, advancing in those brief intervals the way water finds the low point in a floor, and the 15 seconds of light was simply the obstacle it had learned to pace itself around. I reset the cycle to 3 seconds and went to bed and did not sleep once. Between 1 in the morning and 4, the sensor fired 112 times. I watched each alert hit my phone in rapid succession, a drumbeat that would slow and then quicken and then slow again. It was testing the interval, crossing the reset window, retreating when the light came, then crossing again, probing the rhythm for a gap long enough to finish whatever it was measuring out. I do not remember closing my eyes. One moment I was watching the numbers climb on my phone screen, and then there was nothing. And then the sensor was screaming, not firing, not cycling. Screaming, rapid and continuous, each alert colliding with the next before the previous one had finished. A sound like something sprinting across a floor that had no floor, and I was upright before I had decided to move. My hand already finding the lamp, the overhead, the strip of lights behind the television, every switch I could reach in the span of a single lurching second, and the room came up white and total, and I saw him. Not it. Him. He was standing in the corner beside the television with his arms at his sides and his head bowed at a slight angle, the way a man stands in a waiting room when he has stopped bothering to check the time. His clothes were dark with old dirt, the fabric gone soft at the elbows and collar, and his skin was the colour of something kept too long from daylight. His eyes were open, and they were on me, and the expression in them was the worst thing I have ever seen on a human face, because it was not hunger, and it was not rage, and it was not anything I had a word for. It was patience, the deep structural patience of a thing that has been doing this long enough that waiting and arriving feel like the same moment. I shouted. The word left me before I knew what it was. He raised his head a fraction, the way you do when someone finally calls your name, and the sensor fired again because he was still moving, his weight rolling forward by degrees so small I could only measure them by the tightening in my chest, and his eyes did not leave mine for a single second of it. The police came in under 4 minutes. I know because I was sitting on the curb across the street counting seconds the way a drowning man counts strokes, and I did not stop counting until the first cruiser pulled up and I could point at my own front door with a hand that would not fully close. They found him exactly where I had left him. He had not moved to a chair. He had not moved to the door. He was standing in the same corner with his arms at his sides and his head at that same slight angle, and the officers approached him the way you approach something you're not entirely sure is real, and he went with them without a word, without resistance, without a single change in that expression that was not hunger and not rage, and was only patience, patient and complete, the way a season is patient. It was the detective who called me 2 hours later with the particular flatness in his voice that professionals use when they have seen something they will not be describing at dinner. They had found the space above my bedroom, a hollow pressed down between the insulation bats, the pink fiberglass compacted by long use into something almost deliberate, something almost domestic. A body had rested there. A body had rested there many times, and directly above the pillow, where my head had been each night, the plaster had a gap no wider than 3 fingers, and through that gap the space above looked down into the dark below. The camera footage confirmed what the gap implied. The recording I had made to catch something moving through my corner in the night had been angled upward without my thinking about why I had angled it that way, some instinct I had not had the language for, and the lens had found the gap, and the gap on the earliest recordings was empty, and then on a night I could not place precisely it was not empty anymore. A face, still and close, and tilted forward at that same slight angle, 18 inches above where I slept with my eyes closed and my chest heavy, and my mind building explanations out of old psychology and internet searches, assembling the architecture of a rational answer to a question that had a man in it. He had learned the camera. He had learned its position and its angle and the precise geometry of stillness that kept his face outside the frame, and on the nights he had not been still enough, I had looked at the footage and seen movement and called it compression artifacts and gone back to sleep directly beneath him. The sleep paralysis, the weight on my chest, the figure in the corner that was never there when I turned on the lights, because the figure in the corner had not yet come down. All of it was practice. All of it was a man 18 inches above my face in the total dark, perfecting the work of not being seen inside a house where someone had already decided, with great confidence and considerable relief, that he understood exactly what was haunting him. He was awake before he understood what awake meant. The ceiling was there, pale and close, and the room was wrong in the particular way it was always wrong on these nights. The air thickened to something just below water, gravity doubled and personal, pressing him flat against the mattress with a patience that felt deliberate. He could not move his hands. He could not turn his head. He could breathe, barely, in shallow increments that did nothing to satisfy his lungs. And the figure was there. Of course it was there. It stood at the foot of the bed the way it always did, crouched slightly as though the ceiling troubled it, its shape absorbing the dark rather than displacing it. No face. There had never been a face. In the 4 years he had been waking to find it, he had never once seen anything on that smooth, tilted head that resembled a feature. But it was not looking at him. That was the thing. That was the wrong thing his mind kept circling, unable to land. In 4 years it had never looked anywhere else. Its head was turned toward the wall, the shared wall, the one with the water stain shaped like a long hand, the one that separated his apartment from the one next door. It was utterly still in a way it had never managed before, not the restless, predatory stillness of something that wanted him, but something colder than that. Something that was listening. He knew the rules. He had always known the rules. Sleep paralysis onset, rematonia persisting into wakefulness, the brain's threat detection system conjuring shapes in the dark, because shapes in the dark once meant something with teeth. He had read the studies. He had printed one out years ago at 23 and kept it folded in his nightstand like a prescription. Hypnagogic hallucination, threat simulation, misfiring amygdala. The words were worn smooth from use, polished down to nothing by the number of times he had turned them over in the dark. He tried them now. They did not take, because episodes lasted seconds. The literature was consistent on this. The subjective experience of duration distorted by fear, the whole thing resolving in under 2 minutes for the vast majority of cases. He knew this. He had cited this to himself on 100 nights exactly like this one, and it had always been true, and the thing had always turned back to him eventually, and the paralysis had always broken, and he had always been alone. But his body was keeping its own count now, something deep and chemical below the reach of words, and it was telling him 30 minutes. It was telling him that his shoulders had grown stiff in this position, that the particular ache behind his right eye had had time to build from nothing to something insistent, that the pale square of the window had not shifted even slightly because the night was not going anywhere. The figure had not moved once. The paralysis broke without ceremony, no gasp, no violent lurch back into his own body, just a quiet permission granted somewhere below thought, and his lungs filled and his fingers curled and he was sitting up before he understood that he was moving. The figure was gone. The corner held nothing but the water stain and the dark, and the room was exactly as it had always been, and he was alone, and his shirt was soaked through to the skin. He sat with his knees drawn up and his breathing loud in his own ears for a long moment, and then some instinct he could not name turned his attention to the wall beside the bed, the one that separated his apartment from the one next door. He looked at it the way you look at something you have been avoiding looking at, with the specific reluctance of a man who suspects that looking will cost him something. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the plaster. The cold hit him like an open mouth. Not the mild, impersonal cool of an exterior wall in October, but something active, something directional, a cold with an appetite, pulling warmth out through his skin and into whatever waited on the other side. He should have pulled his hand back. He held it there instead, and then he felt it. So faint he almost filed it away under his own heartbeat, almost let the explanation settle over it like a sheet. A rhythmic pressure against his palm from the other side of the wall, not a knock, not a sound at all, a leaning. He made the coffee on automatic, hands moving through the ritual without instruction, and it was only when the mug was in his hand and the steam was rising, and he was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at nothing, that the thought arrived. Aldous. He turned the name over slowly, the way you turn over a stone you have just noticed has been sitting in the same spot for too long. Tuesday. The paper bags, always the same corner store, always the same quiet shuffle down the hallway, always the same small nod that meant nothing, and somehow meant everything about the particular grammar of living alone, in close proximity to another person who was also alone. He had not seen him. He set the mug down on the counter and stood very still, running back through the last week and a half the way you run your tongue over a place where a tooth used to be. Not once, not in the hallway, not through the thin sounds that pass between walls, not the familiar creak of the man's door at 6:40 in the morning, which he had never consciously registered until this moment, when its absence opened something up in him that he did not have a clean word for. He walked to his front door. He stood in front of it with one hand resting against the wood, not quite reaching for the handle. The hallway on the other side was perfectly quiet. He could feel that quiet the same way he had felt the cold through the plaster, like pressure, like something patient and waiting. He opened the door. He told himself it was the same as the others. He told himself that in the first second, before the second arrived and made a liar out of him, it came through the corner of the room the way it always did, that wrongness of shape and stillness, the particular quality of dark that is not just an absence of light but an absence of something else, something he had never found the word for. He kept his breathing even. He had learned that much in 20 years. He watched it from the bed without moving, his eyes tracking it the way you track something at the edge of a cliff, careful, deliberate, not letting the watching become the thing that tips you over. And then it crossed the room, not walked, the space between where it had been and where it was simply stopped being relevant. One position, and then another, the interval between them erased, and he felt the erasure in his back teeth. A pressure, like a change in altitude. It reached the wall beside his bed, the wall he shared with Aldous. It leaned forward. He watched the upper half of it disappear into the plaster the way a hand disappears into cold water, smoothly, without resistance, without the wall acknowledging what was passing through it at all. The lower half stayed, dark and rooted and still, standing in his room like a post sunk into soil. And the understanding moved through him quietly, the way the worst things always do. It was not here for him. It had never been here for him. He was the door. He was simply where it had learned to put its hand. He knocked the next morning with his knuckles flat against the wood, a casual sound, the sound of a neighbour with no particular reason for alarm. Nothing came back. He told himself Aldous was a late sleeper. He told himself that through the afternoon and into the evening, when he knocked again, and the silence on the other side was so complete it felt architectural, like the apartment was holding it. On the third day he went downstairs. The building supervisor was a woman named Carla, who had the face of someone who had been waiting for a specific piece of bad news for a long time. She listened to him without surprise. She took the master key from the hook beside her desk without rushing, without asking questions he might have expected her to ask, and he understood in that moment that she had done this before, in this building, in some form that rhymed with this one. The paramedics used careful, professional language, acute catatonia, unresponsive to stimuli. They moved around Aldous with efficient, practiced calm, and Aldous lay in his bed with his eyes open, and his chest rising and falling, and his gaze fixed on the ceiling as though he had found something there worth watching for the rest of his life. The narrator stood in the doorway and looked at the wall. On Aldous's side, the plaster had darkened in the shape of a hand. Not a water stain, not mould. A compression, as though something had pressed against the surface from the other side, and the wall had simply kept the memory of it. He moved to the couch that first night with a pillow and a blanket and the particular logic of a man who believes that distance is a form of argument. It was not. The figure came anyway, resolving out of the dark corner near the front door the same way it always had, the same slow materialization, and he lay still with his eyes mostly closed and watched through his lashes as it crossed the room without pausing. It did not stop at the foot of the couch. It did not seem to notice him at all. It walked past him with the purposeful quiet of something that had already moved on, crossed the living room in long, unhurried strides, and passed through the far wall without slowing, the way a hand passes through still water. He did the geometry in the morning with his palm flat against the plaster. The Marchetti unit. He knew the name from the mailboxes downstairs, printed in faded marker on a strip of tape. He had seen her a handful of times, a woman in her late 20s or early 30s, scrubs and soft-soled shoes, the particular efficient posture of someone who worked hospital hours. On the fourth morning, he was in his doorway when she came out. She pulled her door shut and checked the lock twice, and then stood for a moment with her keys in her hand, looking at nothing. Her face was the colour of someone who had not truly slept in longer than she could name. Not tired, depleted, as though something had been at her all night, drawing down the reserves she had not known were finite. The doctor's office smelled of old paper and the particular antiseptic neutrality of a room designed to make people feel safe enough to say difficult things. Dr. Reyes had not interrupted once. He had written steadily, his pen moving in small economical loops, and when the narrator finished speaking, the doctor set the pen down flat against his notepad and was quiet for a moment before he asked his question. Had he been the first tenant in that apartment, or had someone lived there before him? A sublet, the narrator said. He had moved in quickly. He did not know. Dr. Reyes nodded once, the way a man nods when an answer confirms something he already suspected. He explained it slowly and without drama, the way a physician delivers a prognosis he has delivered before. A small number of documented cases, environmentally anchored. Not the sleeper, the location. The narrator heard the words and felt the floor of something tilt beneath him. Not attached to the dreamer, attached to the room. He thought of the hand pressed into the plaster. He thought of the figure that had never once looked at him, never hesitated, never paused at the foot of the couch. The long, purposeful strides of something that already knew exactly where it was going. He had not been visited. He had been opened. Every night his paralysed body had lain like an unlocked door, and the thing had walked through him the way it walked through walls, and the woman on the other side had been waiting in her depleted silence for someone to finally understand what she could not explain.